Shall we begin? Thank you all for coming. I want to thank you all I also want to thank the Philadelphia Fan Expo for having us, giving us an opportunity to talk about Star Wars through the generations. My name is Pete Fletzer. This is my partner on the show, Mr. Chris Ryans. Chris, why don't you introduce yourself to these wonderful people here?
How you guys doing? My name is Chris Ryans. I'm a local Philly guy. I have a Star Wars YouTube channel called Bro Axiom. We talk about Star Wars comics and everything Star Wars related as we can. And so we're here today to talk about growing up Star Wars here at the Fan Expo in Philly.
Absolutely, and as I said, my name is Pete Fletzer. I am one of the co-hosts of Force Connect. Force Connect is a live show we do every Friday nights on our YouTube channel. So if you enjoy this, you want to hang out with us on Friday live on our channel, we take your calls, and actually we'd love to get some of your questions and comments as we go throughout the day. Today that mic is hot, so feel free to join us. Check us out. I'm done selling stuff, Chris. Let's jump into this. We were talking about growing up Star Wars and Star Wars through the generations. Star Wars is 46 years old. 46 years old. It was born in 1977. If Star Wars was a person, it would be Gen Xer.
Yeah.
Although none of these people look like Gen Xers in this picture.
Star Wars' back would be hurting right now.
Star Wars would be in pain. They would have said, "This room is too far away. I'm not going to watch this presentation." But the maker of Star Wars, a guy named George Lucas, he's actually more baby boomer. Technically, he's silent generation, but he's got sort of baby boomer sensibilities about the way he told his stories, his pieces of the Star Wars stories. But at the end of the day, we thought it would be interesting to take a look at Star Wars by generation. And because I think you're going to see that every generation has looked at Star Wars a little bit differently. Every generation has taken something a little bit differently from it and approaches it differently. And then, more importantly, interacts with each other a little bit differently. How many baby boomers do we have in the room? Yeah, right, the boomers. Gen Xers? There we go, there's our people. Millennials? Yep, yeah. Gen Z? Yeah, like one or two Gen Zs in the room. Most Gen Zs aren't old enough to be drinking, that's the funny part. Which if you watch Force Connect on Friday nights live, we do a little toast to you every Friday night. So Gen Zs, you're welcome, but you have to come with your parents. Chris, let's define sort of which generation we're from. Tell us a little bit about your Star Wars journey and your first time seeing Star Wars.
Well, let's see. I was born in '75. I was 2 years old when Star Wars came out. Don't remember the first 2 years of my life. There was no Star Wars in it. But
I don't remember the last 2 years.
But let's see. So my first, I think honestly, my first time seeing Star Wars was and please forgive my dad for this. May he rest in peace. He had a bootleg film reel of Star Wars. So at home, before I was old enough to even go to the theater and whatnot, we used to watch it. We had this big white wall, so we would watch it on at home all the time until I was old enough to like really go to the theater to go see it. No sound. I didn't know what was what, but I loved it, and I loved it. And we went out to a store. If anyone our age knows, there's a store called Best back in the day. And that's where I got my first two Star Wars figures, which was Han Solo and Luke Skywalker. And then it just grew into, I have way too much plastic in my house now. But yeah, that's pretty much the start of my Star Wars fandom. Like watching on the screen, like just thinking about it right now, my first thought is seeing Vader walk through on the tent of E4 and like stand there and pose and look at all the depth around him. So that's like my first visage, my first image of Star Wars, the first thing I think of.
And since you didn't have sound, you thought he was saying like, "Oh, this looks nice.
This is nice.
This is nice. We should buy this place." This is so. Well,
way different.
Way different. Without James Earl Jones, it's not the same. My first Star Wars memory, I was born in 1970, so I saw Star Wars the year it came out in the theaters. But my first Star Wars memory is this T-shirt. My grandmother gave it to me for my 7th birthday. And the funny thing about this is I saw that and I thought C-3PO was a bad guy. And I have no idea why. I mean, looking at it now, it doesn't make any sense. But Star Wars became my life. Star Wars became everything about me from that day forward. I went on to write for Star Wars Galaxy magazine back in the 90s, and now running the podcast. But Star Wars, I don't remember seeing the movie, but I remember driving home. We sat in, my parents who are here with us today, they're way far back of their station wagon because safety wasn't yet invented. And I remember trying to shoot TIE fighters as they went by. As the cars passed us on the highway, they were TIE fighters to me. But let's talk about Star Wars a little bit through the generation. And again, if you have questions or comments when we get through a handful of slides, we'd love to hear from you. Come on up to the mic. But Generation X, we'll start there because we kind of feel like we own Star Wars, and not in a gatekeepery sort of way. There's no room for gatekeeping, but more in that sort of like, this is my favorite band. I discovered them before anybody else did. I had the cassette bootlegs. Star Wars was ours, and it was because it was the perfect time. Right? It was a generation that was, look, as I said, safety was not yet invented. Statistically, 50% of us kids came home to divorced parents. Our houses were empty. We spent all our time playing with each other outside without helmets until it was too dark to play. But we played with each other, and it was also the last time that there was entertainment that you couldn't plan. Meaning, it had to be planned. It was appointment only television. If you missed Dukes of Hazzard on Friday night, you missed it. You have to wait for reruns and hope you catch it again. If you wanted to see Star Wars again, you had to talk your parents into it. You had to get them to take you to the theater. But we all wanted to play with Star Wars. So this is why the action figures became so important and really dramatically impacted the way Generation X looks at Star Wars, because we created our own stories. Those action figures you had. Those were the stories that we created. We created the headcanon for Hammerhead and Walrus Man and Snaggletooth. And that also sort of inherently created a more solidified ownership in our heads of what it was. Again, not in a gatekeeping way, but in a, man, this is my stuff. And if you go back, and any of us who grew up through Generation X, Star Wars is one of the first things that comes up as part of your memories with your friends when you see them again after many years. But then we hit the dark times. Then after Return of the Jedi, there was nothing. There were books, hundreds of EU books, but there was nothing really on the horizon. And during that time, the millennials were born. And the millennials came in and they got their own Star Wars saga as well. But let's talk about the millennials. We talked a little bit about Generation X coming home to empty houses. There was almost a swing to the other way. Right, and I'll say this, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but this is the generation where people talk about participation trophies. I know millennials are not participation trophy kids, but that's the impression. But this was also a generation that loved to hang out together, and they were also, you guys were the first ones that also, like, video games were your life. How many of you played Masters of Kara's Galaxy? Yeah, nobody wants to admit it, but everyone's like, yeah. Oh, one person? He's like, no, I played it. That was me. I didn't, I had totally forgotten, and I don't know if you remember this, Chris, but episode 3, the video game was out before the movie.
Yep.
So you could actually play and engage with Star Wars through video games.
I did not play it.
You did not?
Not until afterwards.
I was already ruined by Qui-Gon's Noble and the Phantom Menace.
Yeah, that one got me.
But the difference too is Star Wars was over before these kids were born. But Star Wars was still around. It was everywhere. It was on the videotape shelf that you had in your living room in various forms, whether it was special edition or otherwise. There was the Star Wars trilogy was available. The Timothy Zahn Thrawn books were out, and action figures were back. But the difference was he wasn't Walrus Man anymore. He was Ponda Baba, and he had a backstory, right? So the stories that were built were being built on existing lore. So it was a different way. But the other thing that was really important about this generation is Star Wars was not seen in a theater in almost 20 years. So when the Phantom Menace came out, people waited in line. People waited in line for weeks, days. How long did you wait for it?
Oh yes.
How long did you wait?
When Phantom Menace was coming out, I remember I sat in line for, and it's like I did we did a pre-order on our tickets back then.
Right.
You know, right, pre-order. I mean, like you're physically sitting in line 3 weeks beforehand to get these tickets, and I think I was in line for, I want to say 8 to 9 hours.
Really?
And that was one of my favorite experiences. That was like my Star Wars celebration before Star Wars Celebration.
Yeah.
There were so many other Star Wars fans, like, you know, dedicated hardcore Star Wars fans in line. They were like bonds were made like in line. We did trivia, that sort of thing. Like my brother had drove by and like just brought me lunch and left. He let me do all the work. So yeah, it was like stuff like that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it was that bringing it back to the theater, which was great. But how many of you remember the response to the Phantom Menace? It was not well received by the OT fans, right? And I will admit, I was one of them. I'm sorry,
was not.
you were not.
I was not. I loved it all.
You were more advanced, smarter than I am.
I'm the kind of person who, if you put Star Wars on whatever, I'm like, I love it, and I need 5 of it. You know, that's the way I am.
It's not an addiction if you can stop.
That's right.
But you can't stop, Chris.
I can't
That's
stop.
the problem.
It's an addiction.
But this was the first time there was a major rift in the fandom. Sure, there was the Greedo shot first thing.
Well, I would say the first time that, for me, as a kid growing up, I wasn't like a bubble as far as like my Star Wars fandom. It was me, my older brother, and a couple of my best friends, and that was it. That's the only like outward kind of thing I had as far as Star Wars went, as far as community goes. Not until the special editions came around,
right,
is when I start to see that other fans maybe didn't like certain things. And like before, I thought that all Star Wars fans were like me, but like, oh, we just love it all. I thought they were like me, but no. After a while, I was like, oh, wait, are we just like Star Trek fans? Like that was my first thought, because you know how Star Trek fans can be, and then like it turns out like, oh man, we're just as bad as they are when it came to special editions. But yeah, but it wasn't. It didn't get really really bad with the fandom until Phantom Menace.
Yeah, and Jar Jar Binks was not. The sad thing is, I don't know how many you know, like Ahmed Best literally contemplated suicide because of the way he was attacked by the fandom. A little story, I've told it on the show before, but one of my favorite stories, I was at the New York City premiere for the Phantom Menace, covering it for Star Wars Insider magazine, and I remember watching the red carpet, and you had, Liam Neeson was there, and there was a bunch of others, and Ahmed Best was this young guy, and I remember somebody was interviewing him, and he's glowing. And he's like, but that Jar Jar Binks character, that dude was cool, and I remember just how happy and excited he was. Yeah. It made watching the attacks that came on him that much harder. He was just a great human being, and of course now, luckily, he's back in the fray, etc. But it was interesting because as much as we look at this and we go, well, that would never happen again, we are now coming into the sequel trilogy and the Disney era of Star Wars. Yeah. Where there is obviously some very specific and unique challenges facing that. But let's talk about Generation Z. Again, most of you are not yet old enough to drink legally. It is a generation that is excited and ready to make social change, but they're pragmatic about it. And there's expectations. You call them a social justice warrior in an attempt to insult them, and it's a badge of honor. Right. It's a group that lives on their phones. I mean, yeah, we grew into the internet, and millennials had the internet, but these guys document everything. And if they have an opinion on it, they talk about it immediately. And that's great. But it's also a generation, from that perspective, then, that probably expects Star Wars to be seen in their own image. Because when Lucasfilm was sold to Disney, we were excited. We were like, more Star Wars, bring it. Oh, and you're going to do a movie every year, and there's going to be more stuff, and you're going to build a theme?
At first, I stood there in silence at first when I saw that Disney had bought Star Wars. I was like, this is my worst nightmare come to life. And then it wound up being amazing, so I'm glad
it became other people's worst nightmares, but you were
cool
with it.
I
was
glad
cool with
I
it
was
also.
wrong.
And I mean, I remember, it was right after Hurricane Sandy had just happened. And I literally remember sitting in my house with no power and looking at Facebook and seeing, oh, Disney just bought Star Wars, that's exciting. We were excited, but honestly, Generation Z, well, first of all, they were too young, but for the most part, didn't care because it was Star Wars. Star Wars has always been there. It's been a part of the culture. It's as much a part of the fabric of our existence as anything else. So to them, But I believe that Generation Z has an expectation that if you're going to retell Star Wars or continue to tell the Star Wars story, it needs to be in their image. And I think that that's an interesting concept, that Generation Z believes that Star Wars, any story that's being told, needs to be told in their image. And think about it, the first images that we saw from the first movies coming out in 15, 18 years, whatever the number was, the very first image was a black stormtrooper. We had a female protagonist. We had an emo villain. All right, well, I mean, but he was Generation Z. He was the end of that millennial generation, or the millennial generation. This was the Star Wars that people who were getting it now, it was becoming their Star Wars. Just like the OT was owned by Generation X, and the PT, prequel trilogy, was owned by millennials, this would be theirs. I remember my daughter, before seeing the movie, she was 7 years old, 5 to 7 years old. She made her own Rey costume before she even saw a single frame of the movie. She was in that princess phase, and Star Wars, she could do it. This was her thing. But of course, the internet was in full swing. And so the generation that recognized, first of all, had seen sort of some of the ugliness of Star Wars, also recognized that, by the way, there's clicks in being angry, and where there's clicks, there's money. And what has happened is the Star Wars fandom has now been sort of seen as some of the most toxic fandom. In fact, Wired magazine says that it's the second most toxic fandom behind Elon Musk fans and slightly ahead of PewDiePie fans. So it's not a great place to be, which is one of the things we want to talk about today. Because Star Wars has survived for 46 years. If you're around for half a century, there's got to be some sort of more of a more harmony. And it's Star Wars is going to the future. This is my son at Star Wars Celebration last year. There he is. Star Wars is now being built for these guys, the next generation. And I think there's maybe I'll start, Chris, with a question for you.
Yeah.
Respond to one of the arguments that happens in social media is Star Wars is for 12-year-old children. Is that true?
Yes. And everyone else in between.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's in a spot where I think sometimes what happens is people bring more of their history to it, as we just talked about. There's this whole concept of what Star Wars should be to the different generations. And if it doesn't happen the way they expect it, it's headcanon. Headcanon is the worst thing to happen to any franchise, but Star Wars seems to take bigger hits on that. Before we continue, we do have an open mic, so if anyone wants to come up, comment, give us a question, whatever, please feel free to join us as part of the conversation. It's like our Friday night show. But Chris, talk to us about Star Wars as the fabric of a generation. So I look at it as Star Wars is as much part of the culture today as religion, as music. I know there's a dangerous thing there. I'm not going to pull a John Lennon, but Generation X's and Boomers will get that one. But no, maybe they don't. Talk to me though about Star Wars as that basis for who this generation is in many ways, or multiple generations. Yeah, let's start with that X and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was all I ever knew. Star Wars is pretty much my religion, in a way. But Star Wars has helped people of any generation. It inspires people to become better than what they are. That's pretty much what I've taken from it from over the years. And I believe that with each generation, they find something to hold on to that becomes like an integral part of who they are. So yeah, and I love that Star Wars is changing and evolving with each generation. That needs to happen. It cannot stay in one static mindset.
Yep.
So I'm very glad that that's happening, and it's changing and growing for everyone around it.
Yeah, I think when people look at Star Wars and try to address why they might have a problem with the current Star Wars or not be able to move past what they brought with them, I think I think that's exactly what it is. When a story is 46 years old, when a story has been around for half a century and is coming up, it's entering its 4th generation right now. If the story doesn't evolve, it doesn't survive.
Yeah.
And if it's good enough to last that long, if it's powerful enough and has enough impact for that to go along, it needs to change. It needs to reflect the audience that is taking it in.
Absolutely, and it's one of the positive things besides like a deluge of Star Wars content that has come out since Disney has taken over. Is that just like with that first image that we saw of Finn, for the longest time for me, I only had, as far as representation goes, Lando Calrissian, and then 16 years later, Mace Windu. That's it. And maybe like some other like tertiary characters, like Jedi Knight in the background in the prequel trilogy or something like that, or in the original trilogy, like an X-wing pilot that gets blown up in the battle over
There's my
Endor.
people.
But yeah, now he's gone. But yeah, I love that now that there's representation for pretty much anyone out there, sexual orientation, sexual preference, race, anything, and I think that's fantastic. That's the one thing, like something that Christina Ariel said, Star Wars is opening up to let more people in and not to keep people out and keep it only for like one particular type of fan or anything like that. And I love that. I love that Star Wars is evolving. Chewie would still be dead though. That's what I'm like.
They're cutting us off. So if you love these conversations, please follow us on these social media channels, and we would love to keep the conversation going. So thank you all for coming, and we'll be outside giving away freebies.